Welcome back to Exploring the Old Testament. I'm Dr. Hutchins, and today we want to talk about the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, of course, is the last book in the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. And just like the first book was so foundational, this book is incredibly foundational to the history of Israel, their understanding of how they related to God as a nation, and also of all the subsequent history of that nation that we're going to observe in the rest of the Old Testament. So, like I said, this is the last of the 5 books of Moses. Moses wrote the majority of this book. He would have written probably the first 30 chapters, but the last 4 chapters, 31 to 34, talk about Moses' death, talk about Joshua replacing Moses as the leader, and therefore it's quite obvious that Moses did not write those chapters. Possibly Joshua added those chapters to tell about Moses' last days. It's written to the nation of Israel as they are at the east side of the Jordan River, preparing to cross the Jordan River into the Promised Land. And so it is in the final days of Moses' life and just before they're about to cross into the land of Canaan, which would be about the year 1406 BC. So still 1400 years before the birth of Jesus. Now, the book Deuteronomy, the name that we use, comes from Greek, which means second law. So Deutero, second, nomos, law. So it is a second giving of the law of God to a new generation. And so the main idea of the book is that God made a covenant with Israel, but they needed circumcised hearts to keep it. So this covenant that was made at Sinai with that first generation that left out of Egypt, it is being reestablished with their children, the second generation, because the first generation disobeyed God, refused to enter the Promised Land, and therefore wandered in the wilderness for 40 years until they all died, except for the 2 from that generation who wanted to obey God, and that was Joshua and Caleb. So now their children, the second generation, is preparing to go into the Promised Land, and they are reestablishing that covenant that God made with their parents in Mount Sinai, or God rather is reestablishing it with them. And yet it is very clear in this book that there is a problem that was in the people of Israel from the beginning. That problem is going to persist, and one day it has to be solved, and that is the issue of circumcision of the heart. Now, the book of Deuteronomy is structured around 3 speeches that Moses gives to this new, younger generation. So speech 1 is chapters 1 to 4, where he basically overviews the history of the nation of Israel, to that point, obviously. And then chapters 4 to 26 is his second speech, which focuses on the commands of the covenant, including another telling of the 10 commandments. And then in chapters 27 to 30 is Moses' third speech, where he goes over the blessings for obedience, the curses for disobedience. And then, as I said, chapters 31 to 34 is where Joshua is replacing Moses as Israel's leader. So, like I said, Israel is poised to invade the Promised Land. The generation before had refused to enter. They were afraid that they would fail, that they would be destroyed. And now their children, the ones that they were afraid were going to be destroyed by these giants in the Promised Land, those children are the ones who are now grown up and preparing to enter and conquer the land. And they're preparing to go in as a nation with a special covenant relationship with God, where God is actually going to dwell in their midst through the tabernacle. That tabernacle that they built at Sinai is going to be established and set up in the center of the Promised Land, and that God will dwell in that tabernacle, and they will dwell as his people all around the tabernacle in the land. And therefore, they must hold up their end of the deal in the special covenant relationship they have with God. And if they don't, then there's going to be a curse. Obedience results in blessing. Disobedience results in a curse. So the covenant stipulates what obedience to God looks like and what it means to keep the covenant. And of course, there's all different laws, and we could look at some of the strange ones about, what you're supposed to eat and not eat, that you shouldn't have clothes that are of mixed materials, all these different laws that seem kind of strange to us, or ones that seem quite logical to us, like about murder or about theft or that kind of thing. But the main law is in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. And everything else is just kind of an explanation of how they are to fulfill this law. The main law in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5 is simply to love God, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And when Jesus is asked which is the greatest of all the commands, he cites this one in Deuteronomy 6, to love the Lord your God. And he says everything else hangs on that command and one that is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. That these two commands are the ones on which all the other commands make sense and hang. So all the other commands are just ways that we are loving God and loving our neighbors. And Moses says if they do that, if they obey these commands, then they will be blessed. They're going to be blessed in their cities. They're going to be blessed in their fields. They're going to be blessed in their families and their flocks. On the other hand, he warns them that if they disobey, then they will fall under the curse. The curse of God will overtake them. Their cities will be destroyed. Their fields will fail. Their families will disintegrate. Their flocks will not bear. And in the end, God will have to exile them from the promised land in the same way that Adam and Eve were exiled from their promised land from the Garden of Eden. Now, how is Israel going to guarantee that this doesn't happen? How are they going to avoid the curse? What they need to have to obey God is they need a circumcised heart. Of course, circumcision was a sign given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 17 that was done on a part of the body that symbolized that God was going to fulfill his promise to Abraham to bear a seed for Abraham that would save all the world. And but it also is showing symbolically what is needed in us spiritually. It's kind of a physical sign that's showing that spiritually we need to cut off the old flesh that is sinful in the way of Adam, and we need to be renewed in our hearts, because we're all born with these sinful desires that are our primary desires that determine our behavior, that makes us sin, okay? So the Bible's very clear that you're not a sinner because you've committed sin. In fact, it's the opposite. You commit sin because you are a sinner. It is your sinful nature, which is the desires within you, that are working out in your actions. So sin doesn't start with what you do, it starts with the desires of the heart. And if you're going to obey God, you need a new heart. You need a circumcised heart. You need to be born again. All of these are different pictures or analogies to communicate to us the spiritual need that we have, which is to be made new, to be made a new creation, to have our desires, our old sinful desires where we love sin and we hate God, to have that replaced with a new heart that loves God and hates sin. So what Israel needs is they need to circumcise their heart. And they're actually commanded to do that in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 16. But in Deuteronomy 30, Moses prophesies that they will fail to circumcise their heart. They will fail to obey the commands. And therefore, the curse of the covenant will come upon them, and they will be exiled from the land. So already here in Deuteronomy 30, we basically have the path that the nation of Israel is going to walk for the entire rest of the Old Testament. Moses has already prophesied what's going to take place. They're going to go in the land, they're going to fail, they're going to be exiled. But Moses also tells what's going to happen after the exile. After the exile, in the last days, in the final period of human history, God will do for his people what they could never do for themselves and what they would never do for themselves. That is, God will circumcise the hearts of his people. And when God circumcises their hearts, then they will be able to obey God, be able to enjoy his presence, be able to live in his presence and be his people. And this is where we see Jesus in the book of Deuteronomy. So especially the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they're on the other end at the time of the exile from Moses' prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 30. They see that Israel has failed, the exile is coming, and they are remembering, and God is helping them, inspiring them to add to Moses' prophecy in Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Jeremiah is saying that God is actually going to make a new covenant with the people of Israel, where he forgives their sins and he writes the law of God within them on their hearts instead of on tablets of stone. Ezekiel says that God is going to give his people a new heart and put a new spirit within them. So the covenant that God made with Israel that we read about here in Deuteronomy, it testifies to human inability to obey God and keep God's covenant. Israel was never able to keep the old covenant because Israel, like the rest of humankind, like all of us born from Adam, are enslaved to their own sinful nature. And so the book of Hebrews, for example, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 7, the author of Hebrews says, "For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion for a second covenant." So the author of Hebrews is saying there has to be a new covenant, a second covenant, because the first covenant had a fault in it. What was the fault? The author of Hebrews goes on to explain the fault was not in the covenant itself. The fault was in the people, that the people were sinful and therefore they would never be able to uphold God's covenant. But the old covenant stipulations, along with its curses and blessings, no longer apply to us as Christians. So we don't have the same relationship to God that Israel had of blessings and curses. Why is that? Because Jesus has come. The seed of Abraham, the seed of David, he has come. And what did Jesus do for us? He took on the curse of the law for us. So we violated the law. The nation of Israel did. All of humanity has violated God's law. And all of us are under God's curse. We're all exiled from God's presence. We're born that way because of our sinful natures. And as we get older, we do what it is our nature to do. That is sin. And we are under the curse of God so that when we die, we will be exiled from God forever in hell or the lake of fire. But Jesus comes and Jesus takes that curse on himself. And by taking that curse on himself, he frees us from the demands of the covenant, the demands of Deuteronomy. So we see this in Galatians chapter 3, verse 13, where the Apostle Paul pulls out a verse from Deuteronomy 21:23. That verse says that cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And this is what Paul says: Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us, because it is written, "Cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. Jesus became the cursed one on the cross, on the tree, and by doing that, he took the curse from Deuteronomy that we deserve for disobeying the law, and he paid the penalty in his own body, so that now we are free from the law and free to live for God and actually fulfill the law, but fulfill it from a renewed heart, a heart that actually loves God. And that's the command. That's the core command of Deuteronomy. That's the core command of the entire Bible, to love God. By believing in Jesus Christ, God changes us. We are born again. He circumcises our hearts. He changes us. He changes our desires. He fills us with his own Spirit, who then gives us the ability to obey him so that we can truly be the covenant people of God that he always intended us to be. People who live in his presence and who are his people.